The hospital sat at the edge of town, a sprawling mass of weathered brick and broken windows. Its name, St. Dymphna's Asylum for the Infirm, still clung to the archway over its entrance, though no one had called it that for decades. Locals whispered that the hospital had been abandoned in the early 1970s after a series of horrifying incidents that were never fully explained. The truth, they said, was far worse than the rumors. It all began with an experiment. Dr. Elias Greaves, a brilliant but reclusive surgeon, had been tasked with a project that was ahead of its time, a revolutionary brain surgery technique to cure extreme mental illnesses. His methods were unconventional, but the hospital administration turned a blind eye because his work attracted funding. What the board didn't know, or chose not to know, was that Dr. Greaves's experiments were spiraling into something nightmarish. Patients admitted to the hospital began disappearing. Official records claimed they had been transferred to other facilities, but families complained that their loved ones had vanished without a trace. The nurses avoided the east wing of the hospital, where the walls were lined with lead to block outside interference, as Dr. Greaves insisted. On those dimly lit hallways, faint, guttural whispers seemed to seep through the walls, like trapped voices clawing for freedom. Things came to a head in 1971. A nurse named Clara had stumbled upon something she shouldn't have. She had been passing by the East Wing late one night, drawn by the muffled sound of a child crying. No children were admitted to the hospital, but the sound was unmistakable. Against her better judgment, Clara unlocked the heavy door leading to Dr. Greaves's private lab. What she found made her scream so loudly that other staff rushed to the scene. When they arrived, Clara was gone. Only her shoes remained, neatly placed in the center of the room, alongside the empty keyring she'd carried. The hospital's internal investigation turned up nothing, but staff began to quit en masse, claiming that strange things were happening on the night shifts. Doors slammed shut of their own accord. Lights flickered even when the wiring was checked and declared sound. The shadows in the hallways seemed to move, bending toward anyone walking alone. One orderly, a young man named Victor, began to unravel. He confided in his coworker that he'd been hearing his name whispered in the middle of the night, though no one was around. Worse, he'd seen Clara, or something that looked like her, staring at him from the end of a hallway, barefoot and with her head tilted unnaturally to one side. She would vanish as soon as he blinked. A week later, Victor jumped from the roof of the hospital. His suicide note was short and cryptic. "It won't let me leave. I'm sorry." By then, the hospital's funding had dried up, and it was shut down. The staff left, but the stories didn't. Urban explorers who dared to enter St. Dymphna's claimed to hear distant screams and cries echoing through the empty corridors. Others swore they saw figures in white coats standing at the far end of the east wing, their faces obscured by shadows. But the most chilling account came from a photographer named Mark, who ventured into the hospital with a group of friends one stormy night. Mark's photos revealed details no one remembered seeing. Faint handprints on the windows, a message scrawled on a chalkboard that read, "Don't trust him." In one photo, a figure in a lab coat stood behind his friend Sarah, though no one had been there at the time. When Mark developed the photos in his darkroom, something happened. His friends found him the next day, sitting catatonic in a corner, the film scattered around him. The images had burned into the negatives, but not before capturing one last frame, a close-up of Mark's own terrified face, his mouth open in a silent scream. To this day, St. Dymphna's Asylum remains boarded up, but some nights, if the wind is just right, people say they can hear it. The faint cry of a child, followed by whispers that grow louder and louder until they're drowned out by a scream that shakes the very bones of the town. No one knows what Dr. Greaves unleashed, but one thing is certain. Whatever it was, it never left. The Red Veil Clinic was a place no one spoke of willingly. Tucked deep in the Appalachian Mountains, it was once a thriving hospital in the 1930s, specializing in surgeries no one else dared to perform. It was named for the crimson-tinted curtains that adorned its many windows, though the name took on a darker meaning as the decades wore on. By the 1950s, the hospital was closed under mysterious circumstances. Officially, it was due to structural concerns. Unofficially, everyone knew that something far worse had happened. Even now, years after its abandonment, locals avoided the clinic. Travelers who stumbled upon it described it as suffocating, as if the air itself were pressing down on them, urging them to leave. Most heeded the warning. But in the fall of 1998, a group of college students decided to document the building for a class project. What they found would never make it to any professor. The group, 4 students in total, arrived at the clinic just as the sun dipped below the horizon. The building loomed before them, a monolith of decay, with vines crawling up its crumbling facade and the signature red curtains rotting in the windows. As they stepped through the heavy oak doors, a bitter metallic smell filled the air, like rust or dried blood. Inside, the place was a maze of narrow hallways and peeling paint. The walls were lined with abandoned gurneys, and the floor was littered with medical equipment frozen in time. But the strangest part was the silence. Not the absence of sound, but the kind of silence that feels alive, as though something is holding its breath just out of sight. They split into pairs. It was supposed to make them feel safer, but it didn't. Sophia and Mark headed toward the basement, where they hoped to find old patient records. The stairs groaned under their weight, the sound echoing into the void below. When they reached the bottom, their flashlight beams caught something chilling. Scratch marks etched into the cement walls, deep and frantic. Above the scratches were words scrawled in blood-red paint. "Keep her down there." Meanwhile, Anna and Liam explored the second floor, where the hospital's operating rooms were located. As they passed each room, their unease grew. The walls were smeared with what looked like handprints, dragging toward the floor as if something or someone had been pulled away. In one of the rooms, an operating table stood in the center, its leather straps still fastened tightly, as though the patient had never left. Above it, the same words were scratched into the ceiling. "Keep her down there." Sophia and Mark decided they'd seen enough of the basement and turned to head back upstairs, but the stairs were gone. Not collapsed, not blocked, just gone, replaced by an unbroken wall. Their panic rose as they ran through the labyrinth of corridors, their flashlights flickering. The air grew colder, and with each breath, their exhalations formed clouds of mist. That's when they heard it. A faint sobbing echoed down the hallway. It sounded like a woman's voice, choked with despair. It was coming from somewhere deeper in the basement. Against every instinct screaming in their heads, they followed the sound. Anna and Liam on the second floor were experiencing their own horror. As they passed one of the rooms, the door slammed shut behind them with a deafening bang. The temperature dropped instantly, and a high-pitched wail filled the air, as if the walls themselves were screaming. Liam grabbed Anna's hand and pulled her toward the stairs, but when they reached the stairwell, they froze. A figure stood at the bottom of the stairs, draped in what looked like a medical gown. Her head was tilted sharply to the side, and her face was obscured by long, stringy hair. She didn't move. She didn't have to. The air around her rippled, as though reality itself bent in her presence. Back in the basement, Sophia and Mark had found the source of the sobbing, a locked iron door, rusted and covered in strange symbols. The sobbing stopped the moment they approached. Instead, a low growl rumbled from behind the door. It wasn't human. The lights in the basement flickered violently, and for a brief moment they saw something on the walls, a mass of writhing shapes, human-like but wrong. Their limbs were too long, their faces stretched into grotesque masks of agony. Then the lights went out entirely. On the second floor, Anna and Liam bolted back the way they came, but the hallway seemed endless, looping back on itself no matter how far they ran. The figure from the stairs was now behind them, gliding silently, her feet never touching the ground. Her head twitched unnaturally as she whispered something they couldn't understand, her voice layered with 1,000 others. In the basement, Sophia and Mark's screams echoed as the iron door burst open. What emerged was not a woman, but a towering skeletal creature wrapped in torn red fabric. Its eyeless face turned toward them, and its mouth opened impossibly wide, emitting a sound that was more felt than heard, a vibration that rattled their bones. By morning, all 4 students were missing. Their car remained in the parking lot untouched, but they were never found. Years later, another group of explorers found a camera in the basement of the Red Veil Clinic. Most of the footage was static, but the final clip showed Sophia and Mark standing before the iron door. Behind them, a shadow began to rise, impossibly tall, its gaping mouth stretching toward the lens before the video cut out, No one has dared to enter the clinic since. But on certain nights, if you stand outside and listen closely, you might hear faint sobbing, followed by a deep, guttural growl, and sometimes, just sometimes, the red curtains move. The Blackfield Sanitarium had been abandoned for nearly 50 years, a forgotten relic buried deep within the forest. The building loomed like a mausoleum, its windows shattered, its walls crawling with ivy. Though its history was largely erased from public record, whispers persisted about the night patients, a term locals used with a shudder but couldn't fully explain. In 2022, a small team of paranormal investigators set out to explore Blackfield. The group, comprised of 3 members, Mia, her brother Evan, and their tech-savvy friend Jamie, had made a name for themselves documenting hauntings online. They thought they'd seen everything, but nothing had prepared them for what lurked in Blackfield. The trio arrived just as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows through the skeletal trees. As they approached the building, a strange phenomenon occurred. The forest around them seemed to quiet. No rustling leaves, no chirping crickets, just the sound of their own breathing and the crunch of leaves underfoot. Inside, the air was damp and heavy. The floor creaked ominously as they stepped into the lobby, a cavernous room littered with broken furniture and rusted medical equipment. Mia's flashlight beam danced over a faded sign hanging above the reception desk. "Welcome to Blackfield Sanitarium, where healing begins." Beneath the slogan, someone had scrawled in red paint, "And never ends." Jamie set up cameras in the main hall, while Evan explored the patient rooms on the first floor. Mia stayed behind to document the building's eerie details, her camera capturing the peeling wallpaper and shattered mirrors. When she turned her lens toward the hallway, she paused. Something was standing at the far end. At first, she thought it was Evan, but the figure was too still, its silhouette impossibly tall and gaunt. It stood for a moment before slipping silently into a room. Mia called out, but her voice echoed unanswered. When Evan returned moments later, he swore he hadn't seen anyone. They regrouped in the main hall to review the footage Jamie's cameras had already captured. One of the cameras pointed toward the second-floor balcony, which overlooked the lobby. The playback revealed a shadowy figure standing there, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. As they watched, the figure disappeared, but not by walking away. It simply dissolved, as though the darkness had swallowed it. Determined to push forward, the trio ventured upstairs. The second floor was colder, the walls coated in a thin layer of frost despite the summer night. Evan noticed something first, a trail of wet footprints leading from one room to another. They were barefoot and strangely wide, as if belonging to something not entirely human. Against Jamie's protests, they followed the trail to a room marked Ward 6. Inside, the air reeked of decay. The room was barren except for a single hospital bed, its mattress stained dark with something long dried. On the wall above the bed, words were scratched deep into the plaster. "Help me. I can't wake up." Jamie's equipment started malfunctioning. His EMF detector spiked erratically, and the static from his handheld radio grew louder until a single word cut through. "Stay." The door slammed shut. Mia screamed as they all turned to face it, but it wasn't the door that terrified her. It was the thing standing in front of it. The figure was no longer a shadow. Its skin was gray and stretched taut over its bones, its hollow eyes glinting faintly in the darkness. Its jaw hung open, unhinged, revealing rows of needle-like teeth. The stench of rot filled the room. The creature lunged toward them, its movements jerky and wrong, like a marionette controlled by a violent hand. They scrambled to the opposite side of the room, screaming and banging on the locked door. Just as the thing was upon them, the room plunged into darkness. When the lights of their flashlights flickered back to life, the creature was gone, but the scratches on the wall had changed. Now they read, "You let her out." Terrified and disoriented, the trio stumbled back into the hallway. But the hospital seemed to shift around them. The corridors were no longer the ones they had entered. They stretched impossibly long, their walls pulsating as though the building itself were alive. The sound of distant whispers began to echo, growing louder with each step. The whispers became screams. Panicking, they broke into a run, turning corner after corner but finding no exit. The walls were closing in, the air thick and suffocating. Mia tripped and fell, her flashlight rolling away. As she scrambled to her feet, she froze. In the dim light, she saw them. Dozens of figures standing in the hallway, their faces obscured, their bodies twitching in unison. The figures began to move forward, their steps deliberate, their empty eyes fixed on the trio. One by one, their faces became visible, twisted versions of Mia, Evan, and Jamie, each wearing expressions of unspeakable agony. When the real Evan grabbed Mia's arm, she screamed again, but this time it was from pure fear. Behind him, one of the doppelgangers had caught up. Its long, skeletal fingers gripped his shoulder, pulling him backward. He thrashed and yelled, but it was as if the air around him had solidified, trapping him in place. Mia and Jamie ran, their breath ragged as Evan's screams faded into silence. They found the exit moments later, an open door leading back to the forest. Without looking back, they fled, collapsing in a heap when they finally reached their car. But something was wrong. The forest around them was silent again, and the sky above was too dark, devoid of stars. The car wouldn't start. Jamie's equipment, even his flashlight, refused to work. Mia's phone buzzed unexpectedly. She pulled it out, her hands trembling. A text message appeared on the screen, though she had no signal. It read, "You can't leave until you bring her back." Behind them, the doors of the sanitarium creaked open again. The Ashwood Institute was once the crown jewel of psychiatric care, boasting cutting-edge treatments for severe mental illnesses in the 1960s. But by the 1980s, its reputation had curdled into something sinister. Patients whispered about the Grey Room, a hidden ward where no one returned from. Orderlies refused to speak of it, and doctors dismissed it as delusion. By 1987, Ashwood was shuttered after a violent riot that claimed the lives of several staff and patients. The building was left to rot, its secrets sealed inside, or so people thought. In 2017, a team of urban explorers decided to infiltrate Ashwood Institute for a video project. The group included 5 members: Claire, the fearless leader; Ben, the camera operator; Lisa, the skeptic; Alex, the tech expert; and Danny, the newest recruit. Their goal was simple: find evidence of the Grey Room. They entered just after midnight, the dense fog wrapping the building in an eerie shroud. As they stepped through the front doors, the air felt different, thick, heavy, and strangely cold. Claire noted the oppressive silence. "It's like this place is holding its breath," she murmured, her voice swallowed by the vast, crumbling lobby. Their flashlights illuminated graffiti-covered walls, overturned wheelchairs, and yellowed patient charts scattered across the floor. Despite the derelict state of the building, certain areas seemed untouched: a child's doll resting neatly on a chair, a pair of shoes sitting side by side at the end of a hallway. They started on the first floor, combing through old records. Alex found a blueprint of the Institute, but something about it was wrong. A section of the building didn't line up. "There's a whole part of the second floor that isn't on this map," he said, pointing to a blank space. "It's not in any of the official records either." "The Grey Room," Claire whispered, her excitement barely contained. The group ascended to the second floor. The air grew colder with each step, their breath fogging in the beams of their flashlights. They reached the corridor corresponding to the blank space on the blueprint. It was different from the rest of the building. The walls were pristine, the tiles gleaming as if freshly cleaned. But the smell was overpowering, a sharp mix of antiseptic and rot. At the end of the hallway stood a door. It was made of reinforced steel with no handle or visible keyhole, only a small rectangular window covered in frosted glass. Someone, or something, had scratched words into the metal. "Be quiet! It hears!" Lisa laughed nervously. "This has to be a prank. No way this is real." Danny, curious and reckless, knocked on the door. The sound reverberated unnaturally, as though the building itself groaned in response. A moment later, a faint tapping echoed back from the other side. Everyone froze. "Let's just go," Lisa said, her voice trembling. But Claire was already moving closer, her hand reaching toward the frosted glass. She wiped it clean with her sleeve and peered inside. Her scream tore through the corridor. The others rushed to her side, but Claire was backing away, her face pale. "There's something in there," she gasped. Ben leaned forward, pressing his flashlight against the window. For a moment, he saw nothing but darkness. Then, a face appeared, thin, with hollow eyes and a grin stretched impossibly wide. It was pressed so close to the glass that its skin seemed to merge with it. The smile widened as Ben stumbled back, dropping his flashlight. The tapping started again, faster and louder. Then the door began to shake violently, the metal warping as though it might burst open. A low, guttural growl emanated from behind it, followed by a voice that mimicked Claire's. "Help me. Please, help me." The group ran. They sprinted back down the hallway, but the building seemed to shift around them. Corridors stretched endlessly, looping back to places they'd already passed. Doors that should have led to stairwells opened into empty rooms. Worse, the tapping sound was following them, growing louder and closer with each turn. Ben, still clutching his camera, glanced over his shoulder. In the flickering beam of his flashlight, he saw it. A figure crawling on the ceiling, its limbs impossibly long, its head twisting unnaturally as it moved. Its mouth opened wide, revealing rows of jagged teeth, and it let out a piercing screech that made his ears bleed. "Go! Go! Go!" he shouted, shoving Lisa forward as the thing dropped to the floor behind them. They burst into the lobby, gasping for air. But something was wrong. The front doors were gone, replaced by a solid wall. The windows, too, were bricked over. The tapping resumed, now coming from all around them. It wasn't just one sound anymore. It was dozens, maybe hundreds, like skeletal fingers drumming on hollow wood. Danny pointed to the far corner of the lobby. "Look," he yelled. There, standing perfectly still, was a woman in a hospital gown. Her hair hung in dark, matted clumps over her face. She slowly raised her arm, pointing back toward the hallway they'd just escaped from. "Nope. No way," Lisa stammered, backing away. But the woman's head snapped up, revealing empty eye sockets and a mouth sewn shut with jagged wire. The stitches began to pull apart as she whispered something inaudible, her words filling the room like 1,000 voices speaking in unison. Alex collapsed, clutching his head and screaming. Blood trickled from his ears as the whispers grew louder, becoming a chant. "One must stay. One must stay." The others tried to drag Alex to his feet, but he shook his head, tears streaming down his face. "I can't. It won't let me." Before anyone could stop him, Alex turned and sprinted back into the hallway, disappearing into the darkness. The tapping ceased. The air grew still. The remaining 4 stumbled out of the building just before dawn, finding themselves in the forest again. When they looked back, Ashwood Institute was gone, as though it had never existed. Months later, Claire received a package in the mail. Inside was Alex's camera. The final video showed him standing in the gray room. He was smiling, his head tilted at an unnatural angle. Behind him, the thing with hollow eyes loomed, its grin stretching wider and wider as the screen faded to black. The Hawthorne Asylum had been abandoned for over a century. Its massive iron gates locked tight, and its grim stone walls hidden beneath layers of ivy and moss. Officially, it closed after a fire gutted half the structure in 1903. Unofficially, it was whispered that the asylum's darkest secret wasn't the fire, but what was left behind, the patients who were never evacuated. By the time it became a magnet for ghost hunters and thrill seekers, Hawthorne's reputation was cemented in legend. Locals called it the House of Echoes, a place where screams never stopped, only faded into whispers that never left your ears. In the fall of 2021, a pair of twin sisters, Elise and Abby, decided to explore the asylum for their growing YouTube channel. Unlike most explorers, they had a personal connection. Their great-great-grandmother had been a patient at Hawthorne, committed there in 1898 for reasons shrouded in mystery. Her records had vanished along with much of the asylum's archives, but the twins were determined to uncover her story. They arrived just after dusk, the golden light of evening painting the asylum in an almost serene glow. Armed with flashlights, cameras, and a spirit box, they entered through a broken window. Inside, the air was damp and suffocating, heavy with the smell of mildew and something faintly metallic. Their footsteps echoed unnaturally in the cavernous space. The first few rooms were what they expected: dusty furniture, peeling wallpaper, shattered glass. But as they ventured deeper, the temperature dropped, and a strange phenomenon began. Every so often, they heard faint whispers that seemed to come from nowhere. When they paused to listen, the whispers stopped, replaced by the sound of distant footsteps. They chalked it up to paranoia. In one of the patient rooms, Elise found something odd, a journal lying open on the bed. The pages were damp and unreadable, but one phrase was written over and over on the final page, carved deep into the paper. "They see you when you can't see yourself." Abby shuddered but kept the camera rolling. "This has to be planted," she said, though her voice wavered. The farther they went, the stranger the asylum became. Hallways stretched longer than seemed possible, bending at odd angles. The graffiti that covered the walls was smeared, as though it had been distorted by something moving beneath it. At one point, Abby swore she saw her own reflection in a broken window. But instead of copying her movements, the reflection stood still, its head tilting slowly to the side as she walked away. They reached the main hall where, according to old blueprints Elise had found online, the patients were once gathered for treatment sessions. A large circular mirror still hung on the far wall, its surface cracked into a web of fractures. It reflected the room in jagged pieces that didn't seem to align correctly, as though the angles were slightly off. Elise approached the mirror, shining her flashlight on it. "This is where they used to make patients confront themselves," she said, her breath fogging the glass. "They thought it would cure them." As she spoke, Abby noticed something in the mirror. Her stomach dropped. One of the fragmented reflections showed a third figure standing between them, though the room was empty. The figure was tall and shrouded in shadow, its head misshapen, its limbs too long. Its face, or what should have been a face, was a featureless void. "Don't move," Abby whispered, grabbing Elise's arm. "Look in the mirror." Elise froze, her eyes locking onto the figure. Before either of them could react, the flashlight flickered and the room was plunged into darkness. The whispers returned, louder this time, a cacophony of voices speaking over one another. Words were unintelligible, but the tone was unmistakable. Pleading, desperate, furious. Elise fumbled for her flashlight, her hands shaking. When the beam finally pierced the dark, the room was empty again. But the mirror had changed. The cracks in the glass had spread, forming the shape of a jagged, gaping mouth. Abby grabbed Elise's hand. "We're leaving, now." As they retraced their steps, the asylum seemed to rebel against them. Hallways they'd passed through easily before now led to dead ends. Doors slammed shut on their own. The air grew colder, biting at their skin. Abby noticed something horrifying. The farther they ran, the louder the whispers became, as if the voices were chasing them. Then came the laughter. It started as a low chuckle, barely audible beneath the whispers, but it grew louder and more distinct. It wasn't human. Too high-pitched, too wet, like the sound of nails scraping glass mixed with gurgling water. The laughter echoed all around them, and then, impossibly, it spoke. "She's still here." Elise stopped dead in her tracks, her flashlight beam fixed on a door they hadn't seen before. It was smaller than the others, almost child-sized, and it was ajar. A faint light seeped from the crack. "Elise, no," Abby begged, but Elise was already moving toward it. Inside was a tiny room with nothing but a rocking chair in the center. The chair swayed back and forth on its own, creaking softly. On the floor beside it lay a single photograph, yellowed with age. Elise picked it up, her hand trembling. It was a picture of their great-great-grandmother, seated in the same rocking chair, her eyes hollow black pits. The door slammed shut. Abby screamed, pounding on the door as the whispers reached a deafening crescendo. Inside, Elise's voice cried out, but it wasn't words. It was a blood-curdling scream, cut short as though snuffed out. When the door finally creaked open, the room was empty. The rocking chair had stopped moving. Abby ran, her camera still clutched in her hand. She didn't stop until she was outside, gasping for air under the pale light of the moon. Elise was gone. When the footage was reviewed weeks later, there was one final, unexplained clip. It showed Elise in the rocking chair, her face pale, her eyes black and void-like. Behind her, the shadowy figure loomed, its featureless face inches from hers. And then, in a voice that was not her own, Elise whispered, "Come back. She's waiting for you." The Hollow Pines Care Facility stood deep in the mountains, a derelict hospice long abandoned after a scandal no one liked to talk about. Officially, it had closed in the late 1970s due to budget cuts, but whispers persisted that it was something far darker. Residents of the nearby town claimed they could still see lights flickering in its windows at night, and a few brave souls who ventured inside told stories of things that didn't belong to the world of the living. Most never went back. In the winter of 2020, a group of 5 friends decided to explore Hollow Pines for a documentary they planned to submit to a local film festival. Chloe, the organizer, was passionate about uncovering the truth. Mark, the camera operator, had a knack for capturing eerie visuals. There was Jules, a skeptic who laughed off ghost stories. Emma, who brought a Ouija board for fun, and Tyler, the group's tech expert, who equipped them with motion detectors and infrared cameras. The snow was falling heavily when they arrived, covering the long abandoned driveway in a pristine white sheet. The building loomed like a frozen beast against the dark sky, its windows black and hollow, its walls streaked with grime. The front door was chained shut, but a broken window in the basement offered an easy entrance. Inside, the air was cold enough to bite, carrying a faint odor of mildew and decay. The rooms on the first floor were empty, save for scattered furniture and faded murals that once depicted cheerful scenes of forests and rivers. Chloe noted how eerie it was that the murals seemed untouched, the paint still vibrant despite decades of neglect. As they moved through the building, Tyler's motion detectors began beeping faintly. At first, he dismissed it as faulty equipment, but when the detectors all began pinging in perfect rhythm, despite no visible movement, his unease grew. "This place is messing with the equipment," he muttered, but his voice lacked confidence. They set up in what appeared to be the main recreation room, a vast space with rows of empty wheelchairs and a large cracked mirror on one wall. Emma pulled out her Ouija board, grinning mischievously. "Let's make this interesting." Jules rolled her eyes but played along, as did Chloe and Mark. Tyler refused, opting to monitor the cameras instead. The group gathered around the board, their breath visible in the freezing air. Emma placed her hands on the planchette. "Is anyone here with us?" she asked in a mock-serious tone. At first, nothing happened. Then the planchette began to move. Mark snorted. "Nice try, Emma." "It's not me," she insisted, her hands trembling slightly. The planchette spelled out HELPME. Chloe's eyes narrowed. "Who are you?" The board responded, WATCIN. At that moment, the mirror across the room shattered with a deafening crack. The group screamed, jumping to their feet. Tyler ran over, his camera pointed at the broken glass, which now reflected the room in jagged, distorted fragments. "Whoever's messing with us, stop!" Jules shouted, her bravado faltering. But no one was messing with them. As Tyler examined the mirror, his face drained of color. "Guys, the reflections. Look." They crowded around, peering into the shards. The reflections weren't their own. Instead, they saw a room filled with pale, hollow-eyed figures. The shapes moved unnaturally, their bodies twisted and wrong, their faces locked in expressions of agony. One figure stood out, taller than the rest, with elongated limbs and a face entirely obscured by shadow. It raised an arm, pointing directly at them. The lights flickered. "Let's get out of here," Chloe said, her voice shaking. But the door to the recreation room slammed shut, the sound echoing like a gunshot. Tyler yanked at it, but it wouldn't budge. From the hallway came the sound of faint shuffling, like bare feet dragging across the floor. Then the laughter started, high-pitched, childlike, but somehow guttural and wrong. It grew louder, closer. Mark swung his flashlight toward the hallway. For a brief moment, the beam illuminated a figure standing just beyond the doorway. It was a woman in a tattered hospital gown, her head lolling to one side. Her eyes were black pits, and her mouth stretched into an impossibly wide grin. Then she moved, sprinting toward the door at an inhuman speed. The lights went out completely. Screams erupted in the darkness as Tyler's motion detectors went wild, their beeping blending with the sound of something heavy slamming against the walls. Mark's camera captured brief flashes of movement, hands clawing at the floor, faces pressed against the windows, mouths opening wide to release silent screams. When the lights flickered back on, Emma was gone. Her chair lay overturned, and the Ouija board was shattered on the floor. The remaining four called her name, their voices echoing through the empty halls, but there was no response. The shuffling sounds grew louder again, this time coming from multiple directions. They didn't wait to investigate. The group fled, stumbling through the maze-like corridors. Tyler's equipment kept malfunctioning, his infrared camera showing bursts of static, interspersed with horrifying images. Hands reaching from the walls, faces appearing in the floors. They finally burst through a door into the snow-covered courtyard. Gasping for air, they turned to look back at the building. It stood silent and still, its windows dark and lifeless. "Where's Emma?" Chloe whispered. Before anyone could answer, Mark's camera began to play a recording. None of them had hit record. The footage showed the recreation room, but the group was gone. Instead, Emma stood alone in front of the mirror, her face expressionless. Slowly, she raised a hand and pointed directly at the camera. Then the screen went black. They never found Emma. The Blackridge orphanage had stood empty for over 50 years, a rotting husk of brick and shadow that loomed on the edge of town. It had closed in 1964 after a fire swept through the East Wing, killing dozens of children and staff. Locals believed the place was cursed, and few dared to even walk near it after sunset. Yet for years there were rumors of lights flickering in the windows, of children's laughter echoing through the halls, and of shadows that didn't belong. In 2023, 4 college students, Darren, Sophia, Mia, and Ethan, decided to explore Blackridge for their paranormal podcast. Their goal was simple: record audio evidence of the supernatural. Armed with digital recorders, cameras, and a sense of invincibility, they arrived just as the sun dipped below the horizon. The exterior was exactly what they expected: overgrown weeds, boarded-up windows, and the faint smell of burnt wood still lingering after all these years. As they pried open a side door, the heavy air seemed to swallow their excitement. Inside, the orphanage was a crumbling labyrinth. Old toys and tiny shoes lay scattered across the floors, coated in decades of dust. The wallpaper was peeling, revealing grotesque patterns of mold underneath. The air was thick with an unnatural chill. "This place is definitely haunted," Darren joked, trying to lighten the mood. But his laugh echoed too long, as though something else had joined in. They started in the West Wing, where most of the dormitories had been. As they walked, their footsteps seemed to be followed by a faint pattering, like small feet running across the floorboards. Every time they stopped, the sound stopped too. Sophia brushed it off as an echo, but Mia clutched her recorder tightly, muttering that the sound felt wrong. They reached one of the larger dorm rooms and set up their equipment. Ethan placed a camera near the doorway while Mia turned on her recorder. Darren began reading an old newspaper clipping he'd found about the fire, his voice bouncing eerily off the walls. Midway through, they all heard it, the faint sound of a child humming. It came from the far corner of the room, where shadows pooled unnaturally despite their flashlights. "Did you hear that?" Sophia whispered. Mia nodded, her hands shaking as she pointed the recorder toward the sound. "It's coming from over there." Ethan approached cautiously, his flashlight flickering as he neared the corner. The humming stopped abruptly, replaced by the sound of heavy breathing. He swung the light into the shadows and saw nothing, but when he turned back to the group, his face was pale. "I swear, there was someone standing there." The others didn't get a chance to respond. One of the old metal beds creaked violently, its rusty springs screaming in protest. Then it slid across the floor as if pushed by unseen hands, slamming into the wall with a deafening crash. Sophia screamed, bolting for the hallway. The others followed, their equipment forgotten in their panic. They regrouped in the main foyer, breathless and shaken. "Okay, this is beyond creepy. Let's just leave," Mia said, her voice trembling, but as they turned toward the exit, they realized the door they had entered through was gone. In its place was a solid brick wall. The windows, too, were now covered in blackened wood that hadn't been there moments before. No, Darren muttered, pounding on the wall. Then, from deeper within the orphanage, they heard it again, children laughing. This time it wasn't faint. It echoed clearly, coming from all around them. The sound was joyous at first, but it slowly twisted, growing distorted and malevolent, until it was more like screaming than laughter. "Upstairs," Ethan said, his voice frantic. "We can try to find another way out." Reluctantly, they climbed the grand staircase. The second floor was worse. The air was colder, and the walls seemed to pulse, as though the building itself was alive. They found themselves in a long hallway lined with doors. At the far end stood a small figure, silhouetted in the dim light. "Hello?" Darren called out, his voice cracking. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, unnervingly still. Slowly, they crept closer, their flashlights flickering. When they were just a few feet away, the figure turned. It was a child, a little girl in a soot-streaked nightgown. Her eyes were black voids, and her mouth stretched into an unnatural, toothy grin. She tilted her head and whispered, "You shouldn't have come here." Before they could react, the girl vanished, and every door in the hallway slammed open at once. From each room poured shadowy figures, their forms writhing and shifting, their faces featureless but undeniably human. The shadows moved with terrifying speed, rushing toward them like a black tide. The group ran. They barreled down a staircase that seemed to stretch forever, the shadowy figures close behind. Ethan tripped, and when Darren turned to help him, he saw one of the shadows grab Ethan's leg, pulling him into the darkness. His screams faded quickly. The remaining three burst into what appeared to be the dining hall. The long table was set for a meal, but the plates were filled with ash, and the chairs were all occupied by skeletal figures in tattered clothes. At the head of the table sat the little girl, her grin wider now, her empty eyes fixed on them. "You can stay with us forever," she said, her voice echoing like 1,000 whispers. The skeletal figures began to rise. Desperate, the three ran for a door at the far end of the hall. This one opened, and they stumbled out into the snow, but when they turned back, the orphanage was gone. There was no sign of the massive building, just an empty, snow-covered field. Only two of them made it back to town. Ethan was never found, and neither Sophia nor Mia would speak of what happened that night. Months later, Darren found a recording left on his doorstep. It was Mia's voice, trembling and faint. "We didn't escape, we never left. It's still with us." He played the tape once before burning it, but he couldn't shake the sound in the background, the faint laughter of children. The Graywood Institute had been shuttered for decades, its sprawling campus left to rot in the middle of nowhere. Originally a psychiatric hospital, it had been infamous for its experimental treatments in the 1930s. Patients whispered of the Watcher, an enigmatic figure supposedly tied to a series of unexplained disappearances within its walls. Officially, the hospital was closed after several patients vanished without a trace in 1942, but unofficially, many claimed something evil had taken root there, and it refused to leave. In 2022, a paranormal investigation group called After Dark Files decided to spend the night in Graywood. Known for their online videos exploring haunted places, the group of four, Eli, Dana, Lucas, and Serena, had a reputation for debunking myths, claiming most hauntings were just the power of suggestion. They arrived late in the evening, their van crunching over the gravel road. The Institute loomed ahead, a mass of shadow and jagged edges against the blood-red sunset. The air was unnaturally still, and the surrounding forest seemed to lean in as if watching. "Creepy, but manageable," Eli joked, adjusting the strap of his camera. "Let's give our fans a show." The group entered through the main doors, which had been pried open long ago by previous trespassers. Inside, the building was worse than they'd imagined. The walls were covered in strange graffiti, spirals, eyes, and scrawled phrases like "I tease you" and "never alone." The air smelled faintly of antiseptic, as if the hospital were trying to cling to its old purpose despite the decay. They split into pairs to cover more ground. Dana and Lucas took the east wing while Eli and Serena explored the west. The plan was to regroup in an hour, but almost immediately, things went wrong. In the east wing, Dana noticed the building seemed alive. The corridors stretched longer than they should, and the floor creaked beneath her feet, almost like a heartbeat. At one point, she passed an old wheelchair that hadn't been there a moment ago. Its wheels slowly rotated, even though there was no breeze. "Do you feel that?" she asked Lucas, her voice barely a whisper. "Feel what?" "The air. It's heavy." Lucas shrugged, but his face betrayed his unease. "It's an old building. Probably mold." They continued down the hallway, but the further they went, the colder it became. Dana's flashlight flickered, and the beam seemed to bend, struggling against the darkness. Then they heard it, a faint scraping sound, like metal dragging across the floor. "Who's there?" Lucas called, his voice firm. No response. The scraping grew louder, coming from behind a door labeled Ward C. Against their better judgment, they opened it. Inside was a small room, completely empty except for a single rusted gurney in the center. The scraping stopped. The gurney's wheels were twisted and broken, but fresh scratch marks covered the floor, leading up to where they stood. "I don't like this," Dana muttered, backing away. Before Lucas could respond, the door slammed shut behind them. Meanwhile, in the West Wing, Eli and Serena were dealing with their own horrors. They entered what appeared to be an old therapy room, complete with broken chairs arranged in a circle. One wall was lined with shattered mirrors. Serena shined her flashlight over them, and for a moment her reflection lingered a second too long. "Did you see that?" she asked, her voice tight. "See what?" My reflection. It moved." "But I didn't." Eli laughed nervously. "Mirrors are creepy. Let's just keep moving." But as they turned to leave, every mirror in the room cracked simultaneously, the sound sharp and deafening. A low hum began to fill the air, growing louder until it felt like it was inside their heads. Serena clutched her ears, screaming, while Eli struggled to keep the camera steady. Then the humming stopped. replaced by a single word whispered from every corner of the room: leave. They didn't need to be told twice. When the group finally reunited in the main hall, they were shaken but relieved to see each other. But something was off. Lucas was unusually quiet, staring at the floor, his face pale. Dana kept glancing over her shoulder as if expecting to see someone following her. "What happened?" Serena asked. "We need to go," Dana said flatly. Eli frowned. "We've only been here an hour. We need to go," she snapped, her voice shaking. Lucas finally spoke, his voice hollow. "There's something here. It's watching us." Before they could argue, all the lights in the building flickered to life, casting the hall in a sickly yellow glow. The doors to every room slowly creaked open, and the sound of faint whispers filled the air. "Run," Serena said, her voice barely audible. They sprinted toward the exit, but the hall stretched impossibly long, the doors and windows seeming to shift and blur as they ran. The whispers grew louder, transforming into cries and screams that echoed endlessly. Shadows began to crawl out of the open doors, pooling like liquid before rising into vaguely human shapes. Their eyes, if they could be called that, glowed faintly, tracking the group as they ran. Dana tripped, and when Eli turned to help her, he froze. One of the shadows was standing over her, its form twisting unnaturally. A gnarled hand reached out and brushed against her cheek. Her scream was cut short as her body went limp, her eyes wide and unseeing. "Keep going," Lucas yelled, dragging Eli forward. When they finally reached the main entrance, the door was no longer blocked. They burst outside into the freezing night air, collapsing onto the ground. Behind them, the Institute loomed dark and silent once more. The lights were gone, the whispers silenced. Dana was gone. Weeks later, when Eli reviewed the footage, he found something chilling. In every clip, there was always something in the background, just barely visible. A shadow in the corner, a figure reflected in broken glass. And in the final shot, as they ran down the endless hallway, a tall, featureless silhouette stood at the far end, watching them leave. The last frame, Dana, standing in one of the doorways, her expression blank, her mouth moving silently. Eli enhanced the audio, straining to hear her words. "It sees you. It always sees you." And then the screen went black.